The history of Melbourne is the story of a transformation from a small settlement into one of Australia's principal financial and commercial centres, the second largest city in the state of Victoria. Long before the arrival of Europeans, the lands around Port Phillip Bay and the Yarra River were inhabited by Indigenous peoples who had lived there for tens of thousands of years. At the time of colonisation, the population of what is now Victoria numbered fewer than 20,000 people. These lands served as vital meeting grounds for the clans and provided them with water, food and a safe space for traditional gatherings. Hunting, fishing and gathering formed the foundation of daily life. Many of Melbourne's modern Indigenous residents trace their ancestry to various regions of Australia, though some identify as descendants of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong, the original inhabitants of this area. Although few physical traces of that past remain, the region preserves numerous sites of cultural and spiritual significance. In 2021, the boundary between the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong was officially established. The central and eastern parts of the city belong to the former group, while the southern suburbs fall within the latter's territory. In 1797, George Bass and a small crew became the first Europeans to explore the strait between mainland Australia and Van Diemen's Land, which would later bear his name. He sailed along the coastline of what is now Victoria, reaching as far as Western Port. In 1802, John Murray entered Port Phillip, followed shortly by Matthew Flinders. In 1803, Charles Grimes led an expedition to survey the region. His party landed near Frankston, encountered local inhabitants, and explored the Yarra and Merry rivers. The surveys noted fertile soils, as recorded by James Fleming, but due to dry conditions, Grimes gave an unfavourable report regarding the establishment of a settlement. Despite this, British authorities dispatched an expedition the same year under Colonel David Collins to found a colony. Collins arrived at Sorrento, but, finding insufficient fresh water, abandoned the site and in 1804 relocated the settlement to Tasmania, where Hobart was founded. The region was thereafter left largely to whalers and sealers. Among those early figures was John Pascoe Fawkner, who would later return to the Melbourne area. In 1824, explorers Hamilton Hume and William Hovell discovered fertile lands near Corio Bay. In 1834, Edward Henty illegally established a sheep run at Portland. Around the same time, John Batman began exploring new territories and arrived at Port Phillip in 1835. Over several days he surveyed the coastline and rivers, uncovering vast stretches of land that would become Melbourne's northern suburbs. John Batman, acting on behalf of the Tasmanian Port Phillip Association, negotiated a treaty with 8 Wurundjeri elders, purportedly acquiring hundreds of thousands of acres around present-day Melbourne and Geelong. In his journal, he described a convenient site beside a deep freshwater river, calling it the ideal place for a future settlement. This entry later came to be regarded as the symbolic founding charter of the city. Returning to Tasmania, Batman began preparing a large expedition, but was overtaken by entrepreneur John Pascoe Fawkner. In August 1835, Fawkner's vessel delivered the first settlers, and when Batman's party arrived later, the site was already occupied. Conflict was avoided. Both groups agreed to coexist and divide the territory. Shortly afterward, the New South Wales government annulled Batman's treaty, declaring the land seizure illegal, though it provided for partial compensation. Nevertheless, the settlement was permitted to remain, effectively legitimising its existence. In 1836, the Port Phillip district was established, and Captain William Lonsdale was appointed as the principal government representative. Arriving with a military escort, he formally proclaimed the founding of the settlement and reasserted British administrative control. A first town plan was soon drawn up, the celebrated Hoddle Grid, which laid the foundation for future urban development. In 1837, the settlement was named Melbourne, in honour of British Prime Minister William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne. Land sales began, and the urban fabric rapidly took shape. In the years that followed, the city grew quickly. Trade expanded, businesses appeared, and infrastructure was built. Charles La Trobe played a pivotal role in guiding systematic development and preserving land for public parks, green spaces that remain central to the city's character today. By the early 1840s, the population of Port Phillip had exceeded 11,000. and in 1842 Melbourne was officially incorporated as a town. This status was confirmed by Queen Victoria in 1847. The economy was strengthened by trade, particularly in wool. Merchants organised the supply of goods and the export of produce to England, and regular auctions were established. However, in 1843, the city suffered a financial crisis triggered by land speculation, capital outflows, and falling wool prices. Melbourne began as a collection of tents and huts on the banks of the Yarra River, which served as both a bathing spot and a source of drinking water. By the 1850s, the river had become heavily polluted and caused a typhoid fever epidemic that claimed many lives. Although the Melbourne City Council opened the first public baths on January 9, 1860, people continued to swim in and drink from the river until the building boom that followed the gold rushes. Most of Melbourne's early structures were timber-built, and almost nothing from that era has survived. Two exceptions are the St James Old Cathedral on Collins Street and St Francis Catholic Church on Elizabeth Street. Suburban development began early. The first sale of Crown lands in St Kilda took place on the 7th of December, 1842. The wealthy began building houses by the sea, and a port developed at Williamstown. In 1844, a bridge was constructed across the Yarra River at Swanston Street, replacing private punt services. It was a privately built wooden trestle-toll bridge. In 1850, a government-built sandstone bridge with free passage replaced it. In 1848, Charles Perry became Melbourne's first Anglican bishop, and James Alypius Gould became its first Catholic bishop. The local Indigenous people suffered devastating losses from introduced diseases, their decline hastened by mistreatment, alcohol, and venereal disease. Frontier conflicts also occurred, including the Battle of Yering in 1840. Simon Wonga made efforts to reclaim land for the Kulin people from 1859, but success came only in 1863, when the surviving Wurundjeri and related groups were forcibly relocated to Corranderuk Station near Healesville. In July 1851, following sustained agitation by Port Phillip settlers, Victoria became a separate colony, with La Trobe as its first lieutenant governor. At that time, the white population of the entire Port Phillip district stood at just 77,000, with only 23,000 living in Melbourne itself. Melbourne had already become a centre of Australia's wool export trade. Within months of separation, gold was discovered at several locations across the colony, most notably at Ballarat and Bendigo. The ensuing gold rush radically transformed Victoria and Melbourne in particular. The land speculation of the 1850s drove the construction of numerous stone and brick public and financial buildings. The discovery of gold brought a massive influx of people to Victoria, most arriving by sea. Melbourne's population doubled within a single year. In 1852 alone, 75,000 people arrived in the colony. Combined with a very high birth rate, this produced rapid population growth. Equally rapid was the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from those areas of inland Victoria not yet cleared for sheep runs. In 1853, construction began on the Yan Yean Reservoir to supply Melbourne with water. Piped water began flowing in 1857. Victoria's population reached 400,000 in 1857 and 500,000 by 1860. As the easily accessible gold ran out, many people flooded into Melbourne or joined the growing pool of unemployed around Ballarat and Bendigo. A powerful wave of social unrest arose, demanding that rural Victorian lands be opened to small-scale farming. A land convention was held in Melbourne in 1857, and a provisional government was later formed by land-hungry miners demanding reform. The accelerating population growth and the immense wealth generated by the goldfields fueled a boom lasting 40 years, ushering in the era known as Marvellous Melbourne. The city spread eastward and northward across the flat grasslands and southward along the eastern shore of Port Phillip. Wealthy suburbs such as South Yarra and Prahran emerged, while the working classes settled in Richmond, Collingwood and Fitzroy. The influx of educated gold seekers from England spurred rapid growth in schools, churches, learned societies, libraries and art galleries. In 1853, Australia's first telegraph line was laid between Melbourne and Williamstown. In 1854, Australia's first railway was built in Melbourne, running between the city and Port Melbourne, then known as Sandridge. That same year, the government granted land to 4 religious groups for school construction, including the Wesleyan Methodist Church and the Anglican Church, resulting in the building of Wesley College and Melbourne Grammar School on St Kilda Road. Shortly afterward, the University of Melbourne was founded in 1855 and the State Library of Victoria in 1856. The foundation stone of St Patrick's Catholic Cathedral was laid in 1858, and that of St Paul's Anglican Cathedral in 1880. In 1859, the Philosophical Institute of Victoria received a royal charter and became the Royal Society of Victoria in 1860, the body that organised the only systematic attempt to explore Australia's interior, the Burke and Wills expedition, while all other explorations were largely improvised. A Melbourne Town Council had been established in 1847, and one by one the surrounding suburbs gained town status with their own councils and mayors. In 1851, an elected legislative council dominated by squatter interests opposed universal suffrage. In December 1854, discontent with the licensing system on the goldfields erupted into the Eureka Stockade uprising, one of only two armed rebellions in Australian history. In November 1856, Victoria received a constitution, and the following year gained full responsible government with a bicameral parliament. The defining architectural legacy of this era was the magnificent Parliament House Melbourne, whose construction began in December 1855 and continued through to 1929. The boom driven by golden wool continued through to the 1860s and 1870s. Victoria suffered from a serious labour shortage despite a steady flow of migrants which pushed wages to the highest levels in the world, earning the colony the name the working man's paradise. The Stonemasons' Union won the 8-hour workday in 1856 and celebrated by building the Grand Melbourne Trades Hall in Carlton. Melbourne's population reached 280,000 in 1880 and 445,000 in 1889, making it for a time the second largest city in the British Empire after London. Melbourne became renowned as the world's wealthiest city by area. Rather than building high-density apartment blocks as European cities did, Melbourne expanded in all directions in the characteristic Australian suburban sprawl. The middle classes lived in detached houses on large blocks of land, the working classes in comfortable cottages to the north and west, while older areas like Fitzroy and Collingwood gradually became slums. Most new heavy industry concentrated in the western suburbs. The wealthy built grand mansions by the sea or in the picturesque Yarra Valley. The new suburbs were served by rail and tram networks among the largest and most modern in the world. Civic pride found expression in the magnificent Royal Exhibition Building, erected in 1880 for the Melbourne International Exhibition, yet the long boom ultimately gave way to frenzied speculation and rapidly inflating land prices. Governments channeled wealth into urban infrastructure, particularly railways. Vast fortunes were built on speculation, and Victorian business and politics became notorious for corruption. English banks freely lent to colonial speculators, adding to the mountain of debt underpinning the boom. The inevitable came to pass. In 1891, a spectacular collapse brought the boom to an abrupt end. Banks and businesses failed in large numbers, thousands of shareholders lost their savings, and tens of thousands of workers were thrown out of employment. Unemployment in Melbourne throughout the 1890s likely reached 20%. The city's population, which stood at 490,000 in 1890, barely grew over the next 15 years. Immigration dried up sharply, while emigration to the goldfields of Western Australia and South Africa increased, and the high birth rates of the mid-19th century fell dramatically. Melbourne's status as Australia's largest city lasted long enough for it to become the seat of government of the new Commonwealth of Australia. When the 6 colonies federated in 1901, Parliament House on Spring Street was lent to the Parliament of Australia, while Victoria's Parliament found temporary accommodation in the Royal Exhibition Building. By 1905, Sydney had resumed its place as the country's largest city. Economic growth slowly resumed, and Melbourne's population reached 670,000 by 1914. But the boom years did not return, and wages remained far below the levels of the 1880s. Urban poverty became a feature of city life, and the slum areas of the inner suburbs expanded. Due to long delays in establishing a permanent capital at Canberra, Melbourne remained Australia's capital until 1927. The city's mood was darkened by the terrible sacrifices of World War I. 112,000 Victorians enlisted and 16,000 were killed. Bitter political divisions arose. Catholic Archbishop Daniel Mannix of Melbourne led opposition to conscription, causing a traumatic split in the Labour Party. A further 4,000 Victorians perished in the Spanish flu epidemic that followed the war. A modest revival of prosperity occurred in the 1920s, and the population reached 1 million by 1930. But the Wall Street crash of 1929 plunged the city into another depression. In 1934, Melbourne celebrated its centenary and gained a new landmark, the Shrine of Remembrance on St Kilda Road. The population stagnated, barely reaching 1.1 million by 1940. During World War II, although Canberra was officially the capital, most military and civilian administration was centred in Melbourne. The city's economy benefited from wartime full employment and the influx of American service personnel. Organised crime was rife, with gang fights in the streets of Collingwood and underworld figures becoming the stuff of legend. After World War II, a new era of rising prosperity arrived, fuelled by high prices for Victorian wool, increased government spending on transport and education, and a renewed wave of immigration. Unlike the pre-war migrants, mostly from the British Isles, the post-war programme brought an influx of Europeans, first refugees from Eastern and Central Europe, among them a significant proportion of Jews, followed by migrants from Italy, Greece and the Netherlands, and later from Yugoslavia, Turkey, Hungary and Lebanon. These successive waves fundamentally transformed the city's demographic profile. Premier Henry Bolt, 1955 to 1972, directed resources toward large-scale infrastructure development, though the demolition of inner-city slums and the relocation of residents into high-rise public housing blocks came at a considerable social cost. From the 1970s onward, the pace of change in Melbourne accelerated relentlessly. The end of the White Australia policy opened the city to its first significant wave of Asian immigration from Vietnam, Cambodia and China. Melbourne acquired a large Muslim population for the first time, and the official policy of multiculturalism encouraged the city's many ethnic and religious communities to maintain and celebrate their identities. State patronage of the arts triggered a boom in festivals, theatre, music and visual culture. Tourism grew into a major industry. In 1956, Melbourne became the first city in the Southern Hemisphere to host the Olympic Games. Monash University opened in 1961 and La Trobe University in 1967. The suburbs continued to sprawl from Werribee in the southwest to Healesville in the northeast. Freeway construction was fast-tracked in the 1970s and 1980s, while rail and tram network expansion was neglected, leading to a sharp rise in private car use. In 1989, a financial crisis driven by high interest rates and poor governance triggered a deep recession. Banks and building societies collapsed, property values fell, and population growth slowed as residents moved to other states. The recession contributed to the fall of the Labour government and the election in 1992 of a radical free market Liberal government under Jeff Kennett. His administration restored Victoria's finances through sweeping cuts to public expenditure, school closures, privatisation of trams and electricity infrastructure, and reductions in the public service. The reforms came at a high social cost but ultimately restored confidence in Melbourne's economy and reignited growth. Kennett lost office in 1999, but key landmarks commissioned during his tenure, the Melbourne Exhibition and Convention Centre and the new Melbourne Museum, endure, and many of his reforms have been maintained. In the early 2000s, Melbourne entered a new period of strong economic and population growth under the more cautious Labour government of Steve Bracks, which restored public spending on health and education. The central business district experienced a major resurgence, driven by a boom in inner-city apartment living, the opening of new public spaces such as Federation Square and the new Southern Cross railway station, and continued development of the South Bank and Docklands precincts. By the end of the 20th century, Melbourne's population had reached 3.8 million. The city weathered the financial crisis of 2007 to 2010 better than any other Australian city. In 2009, more new jobs were created in Melbourne than anywhere else in the country. The property market remained strong, though it generated historically high prices and widespread rent increases. Melbourne has travelled a remarkable distance. From a riverside camp to one of the world's most livable cities, gold, immigration, crises and reform have all shaped its character, forging a metropolis that is cosmopolitan, culturally rich and perpetually growing.